Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Our guest speaker is going to need all the time I can give her, I'm sure. So we'll start on time. My name is Bill Keffer. I'm here at the law school in charge of our energy law program. And of course, this is our energy law lecture series. And this is our last event for the semester. You guys who have been with us throughout the semester, remember that we had Bud Weinstein to kind of kick off the series earlier this year, and then had Rick Fletcher just on Monday. And we're fortunate to be able to have Trisha Curtis with us today because she was originally scheduled on March 24th, which was the Monday after spring break when we had our power outage and we had to cancel. And I thought, man, I've lost her. She's a hard one to get. And I thought I'm never going to be able to get her back here. And we were able to find a day today when she could come visit. So I'm glad you're here and I'm glad she's here and that we have this opportunity to hear from her again. And just so you are aware, she's going to stick around and do a Q&A in room 106 at 2 o'clock. That's the normal time for my oil and gas 2 class, but we don't typically meet on Wednesdays. But that's the time and the room where we're going to meet, room 106 from 2 to 2:50. If you're interested, after you hear Trisha speak here at noon, to come listen to her some more, ask some questions, you're welcome to join. You don't have to be in either one of my classes to be there. So feel free to join us in 106 at 2 o'clock. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, thank you, welcome. And we hope you enjoy her lecture here in a minute as well. Let me just make a couple of comments about that. As you know, if you're trying to get CLE credit with the State Bar of Texas, we put the QR code up at the end of the lecture, and you can use your phone to capture the QR code and register your attendance for this 1 hour CLE. If you're with another organization and wanting to get continuing education credit, just let me or Blake Rose know and we can help you with that. Also for our Zoom audience, Trisha wants to make sure you understand that these slides in her PowerPoint presentation are proprietary, so you are prohibited from taking screenshots or otherwise using any of this information that is contained on these PowerPoint slides or the PowerPoint slides themselves for other benefits. So this is really just for this presentation. So be sure and honor that request. I also want to let you know that today's lecture is a special one in the series because it's the Terry Lee Grantham Energy Law Lecture that we do one time a year for one of our special speakers. And a little bit about Terry Grantham. This lecture is made possible through donations given in memory of Terry Grantham. He's a 1982 graduate of the law school who passed away back in December 2012. He was a respected attorney. He specialized in real estate and oil and gas law as a partner at Craig Terrell, Ham, Grossman, and Irwin here in Lubbock, and also served as an adjunct professor of law at Texas Tech. He passed away before I joined the law school in 2014, so I didn't have the opportunity to get to know him, but everybody I've talked to about him just can't say enough nice things about what a great guy he was and what a great supporter he was of the law school. So this lecture is made possible through donations that are made to honor him. So we just want to make sure everybody knows about that. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest speaker today. Trisha Curtis is president and CEO of Petro Nerds Inc. or LLC. She's also a globally recognized expert in U.S. shale markets, geopolitics, and energy economics. She brings extensive experience to the lecture. She's a founder, as I said, of Petro Nerds. She has led critical research, advising, and consulting services for corporations, government agencies, and think tanks worldwide. Her expertise has taken her to prestigious forums, including OPEC in Vienna, Stanford University, Chatham House, and the International Energy Forum in Saudi Arabia. Her career spans roles at the Energy Policy Research Foundation in Washington, where she spearheaded projects for the Department of Energy and Department of Defense, as well as a leadership position at Anschutz Exploration. She has authored numerous reports on U.S. shale, North American midstream markets, and energy policy. In addition to her work at Petro Nerds, she's an economist for the American Energy Institute, a research associate at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and a fellow at the Colorado School of Mines Payne Institute. And she also hosts the Petro Nerds podcast. She holds a Master of Science in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics and is a summa cum laude undergraduate degree in Economics and Politics from Regis University in Denver. She was raised in Northwest Colorado and Southwest Wyoming. She has firsthand experience with the oil and gas industry, having worked on sites alongside her father. I've had the opportunity to get to know her over the last few weeks. She knows more than everybody in this room combined times 100, and it's going to be great to hear her presentation today. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. Help me welcome Trisha Curtis.
Thank you. Well, he set the bar high, so that's awesome. Well, I'm really honored to be here. I'm really happy we could make it work. I love speaking with students, and you guys are third on my university speaking tour. So I was starting out here on March 24th. We were literally about to do it, and then he told me it was canceled. And then I went to Colorado School of Mines on April 1st, and I went to Montana Tech last week and talked at their symposium. And I did those in a Q&A format. So you guys get what I do for clients. You get the deep dive with the slides. So I only have 45 minutes. I'm going to talk fast. We're going to put a lot of information here. And I'm going to kind of gauge by you guys and your body language. Seriously, if you have questions in the last 5 minutes, I want your hands up in the air so that I will stop talking and we will get to them. But we are going to cover a lot of material. And that's because there's a lot happening in the world economy. I would recommend please tune into the Petro podcast. There's a lot of information there that's totally free. I care about this stuff a lot in talking to students because you guys are the future, right? And you guys are the ones that ask questions and lead and know things. But we need that in the industry, but we also need market knowledge in the industry and just in the market. And we don't have enough of this type of information actually in, when I say the market, like the stock market and otherwise. And that's what the podcast does, as well as talks about my business. So big takeaways, big themes I want to hit on, or we'll try to hit on in this talk, in this short talk, is the economy and oil prices. So I do want to spend a little time talking about oil prices. I know you guys might not be leading companies right now, but hopefully in the future you will be, but there folks might be on this Zoom call that are. And so really, if we're thinking about this from a lecture standpoint, or from a university standpoint, the way to think about oil prices is really supply is geopolitics and demand is economics. And we're going to talk about geopolitics a lot, and we're going to talk about economics a lot. Because right now what you're seeing is we have $62 a barrel and change. That is actually a pretty decent oil price for right now. Last week, literally a week ago, we saw $56 a barrel. So when I say volatility, I mean volatility. We have plenty of volatility in this market right now. We have a lot of economic uncertainty, and we certainly have tariffs. And I am going to talk about tariffs. I'm not probably going to talk about tariffs the way most people do, which is this is horrible and the world is ending. It is that actually this administration has done more against China, and I'm absolutely a China hawk, than any administration in U.S. history in 40 years. And it's about damn time. So that doesn't mean there's not going to be economic pain points and lots of dislocations along the way when you're trying to decouple with a major adversary who's also a massive economy, who has worked on entangling every country around the world, economically speaking. It's going to be a little painful. Doesn't mean it doesn't have to be done. So on geopolitics, everything sort of leads to China. China is the backbone between, you know, they're the one buying the oil from Iran. So they're funding Iran, which means they're funding Houthis, they're funding Hamas, they're funding Hezbollah. They are funding the war in Ukraine because they are buying all the stuff from Russia. And Russia is able to do all these nefarious things, including the war in Ukraine. That war is ongoing. So when I say oil prices are not as high as they should be, partly because of that. We have a lot of hot wars happening right now. And oil prices, I don't often say it, but right now they are actually oversold. We should probably be more like $65 a barrel at least, given the hot wars we have and all the sort of geopolitical uncertainties, especially with China. The Middle East, we have a hot war in the Middle East between Iran and Israel and happening in Gaza. The Red Sea, we have 2 aircraft carriers in the Red Sea. We are plinking off all the stuff going on with the Houthis right now. That's a big deal because, you know, for the past few years, since this war that took place within Israel and Israel's response, then the Houthis who are in cahoots with Iran, Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, all those guys, the Houthis have been just plinking off ships in the Red Sea, and basically no ships can go through the Red Sea. So that's a problem. It creates inflation. It makes all these ships have to move around the Horn of Africa, basically have to move around the entire world and not go through the Suez Canal up into Europe, which is the shortest route. So this administration has just come in there, taken a harder stance on Iran, put those aircraft carriers in, and are we just take care of our ships and we're just plinking off these drones. So everybody said it can't be done. It's actually pretty easy. It can be done, and it's being done. So that's positive. That's actually not necessarily, that may sort of equal its way out, but if we're taking a hard stance on Iran, that's bullish for oil prices. Turkey recently, and I had this in there from when I was doing this on March 24th. At that time, Turkey had just arrested, Erdogan had just arrested their mayor, who was the leading candidate who was going to run against the Turkish leader. You have so many of these sort of volatile hotspots. A lot of stuff that was happening geopolitically and in the news you haven't heard about lately because everybody is so engrossed with what's happening in the economy right now and what's going on with tariffs. So it's definitely a news-driven cycle right now. And if you're not hearing all this stuff, it's because that's what's happening. Big point I want to make sure you understand and take away, and we'll hit this fast in the slides, is that energy is everything. We didn't give the presentation on March 24th because the power went out. Power is basic, right? It's everything. We couldn't be here today. You wouldn't be eating that food. We wouldn't be doing all the stuff without energy. Chris Wright understands that. He's working for Donald Trump because Donald Trump understands that, and that's why he took the job, is that energy is everything. It's not a sector of the economy, it's the economy. And I say that really important because that I spend a lot of time with oil and gas, but we're going to talk about power generation, because power generation is not only what turns the lights on, but you need it to be affordable, you need it to be reliable, and you need it to work consistently. Sources like wind and solar are intermittent. So they increase costs because of their intermittency, and they're also dumped from China, and they're really, really cheap when they come from China, but they're not really, really cheap when they get into the grid. And in fact, anywhere you put wind and solar into a grid, you see rising electricity prices, and that's what we've seen. And in a country that's energy rich like we are, we have more oil, more natural gas, and more coal than any nation in the entire world. The fact that we have rising electricity prices is absolutely ridiculous. We should not be having rising electricity prices. We should have some of the lowest electricity prices in the world, and we should be the place that every country in the world, when they want to build something, they come to us because we have the energy to produce it. And that is how China's competing with us on a number of fronts. But one of those is because they're backed up by coal. And so when people come, when biotech companies, any company wants to come, they build it in China because it's really cheap, and they further subsidize it, which makes it very, very difficult to compete with them. And lastly, I want to talk about energy dominance. I know that this is getting lost in the weeds a little bit right now because you're actually hearing a lot from the oil and gas industry, I think a little bit on TV and otherwise within the market, is that you're hearing CEOs not really happy with oil prices at the moment. Although today at 62 and change, they should probably be okay. But they're saying, what does drill, baby, drill mean? That's the biggest question I get from the industry. What does drill, baby, drill mean? And what oil price does the Trump administration actually want? And I think what's really important to appreciate is that really, what does oil and gas leverage actually mean? What does energy dominance mean? And do we have it? And at 13.5 million barrels a day of production, we're the largest producer in the entire world by a wide margin. And we have it. We just have not leveraged that advantage, and we need to. So hopefully we'll have time to talk about U.S. shale. So that's oil prices. Like I said, they're okay right now. They should be a little bit higher given all the geopolitical angst and everything we have in the world. They should be up. The important takeaway here, just thinking about U.S. shale and where it's going and your future job prospects, is that at $62 oil, you can make this work. If you have slightly higher natural gas prices, you can also make this work. It doesn't mean that there's not going to be pain points, but right now, the global economy is not doing that well. They haven't been doing well for years. We've had a ton of inflation. We've had $27 trillion of global economic stimulus from COVID shoved into the system. That means the stock market's overinflated. That means everything's overinflated. And so you've had so much inflation that's really come home to roost, and it's killing the consumer and the economy. So right now, if you were to have, say, $70 a barrel oil, you will guarantee yourself a recession. So we actually cannot have high oil prices, even if the industry wants them. Now, you probably heard a lot about tariffs. These were the two big charts. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, only that the point is that if tariffs were not about China, they should be. And at least on April 2nd, that's what they were about, right? That the China tariffs were way higher. We actually have, so right now the China tariffs on U.S. products are 125%, and U.S. tariffs on Chinese products are 145%. Essentially what that means is that we're not going to trade with China. That's painful because a lot of the cheap stuff that we get, including iPhones and everything else and cheap t-shirts, come from China. So everybody's concerned about iPhones. There's been some things where the administration has said, maybe we'll take a pause on this, maybe we'll let iPhones. Now we have further chip restrictions today. You've seen NVIDIA take a nosedive because NVIDIA gets about 13 cents of their income coming from China. Chinese companies have been stockpiling chips like crazy. When I emphasize this, like you're seeing that a lot of this on TV, is that people are talking about this. but they really don't understand how China competes, and they don't understand why we're taking such a hard stance on China. Like, the US president and the administration isn't interested in having a recession for kicks and giggles. They're not doing this just because it's fun. They're doing this because the situation with China is really, really serious. So what happened on April 2nd was all these guys were listed, including Vietnam, at a very, very high tariff rate. And the reason I said that was great is because if you don't tariff all these other countries, China's just going to dump into Vietnam, and then the products are going to come from Vietnam to the US. That is what happened in the past 4 years under the Biden administration. We have seen China really double down on Vietnam, on Mexico in particular. So several weeks ago, when you're hearing about Mexico and Canada, that was all about China, because so many packages and shipments come in through Mexico into the US. The de minimis rule, that was in place early on in the administration. There was a pause on it, but it is now in place where anything $800 per day per person, that's done. So all that cheap stuff you were getting from Temu and Shein that was made with forced labor, not good, and made with coal-fired power, I care less about that, but the forced labor is huge. That $3 t-shirt you're not going to get anymore because it's made with forced labor and it's completely unregulated. And so bad stuff comes in along with fentanyl and all kinds of other things. So we'll come back to that in a second. The winds have definitely shifted, right? This is a slide literally from the website of the Biden administration. When you looked up energy, this is what you got from whitehouse.gov. This is what Biden and Harris talked about with energy, investing in America. That is the energy website. That was solar panels. And so importantly, put this out. Hopefully you guys find this funny. So on that thing is solar panels. I'm not for solar power, largely because those solar panels came from China. Those come from ingot wafers from the province of Xinjiang, which are from forced labor and are from coal-fired power generation, because you need a lot of heavy industry and intense heat to make them. So that's the Biden administration. That is a bunch of people. A couple of them are looking at the camera. If you zoom in, that is a poster that they're looking at or something, map, whatever they're looking at. If you zoom in, it's just a blank piece of paper. There's literally nothing on it. They couldn't even be bothered to put something on it. And I always say that is case in point of the previous administration and energy, which was absolutely nothing. Fast forward to where we are now. Chris Wright, this was him talking at CERAWeek. We have a person in the Department of Energy, our Secretary of Energy, who is from the industry but knows energy, not just oil and gas because he was from the frack world. He knows energy because he actually worked in nuclear and solar, and he's extremely intelligent. I know him personally. But that's a complete, we did a complete 180 on energy, and that's part of what people are addressing. Now, something that Chris Wright mentioned at CERAWeek was that, everybody talks about how much we have for primary energy, right? What we're actually using. And I think this is very important for a student audience, is that when you think of, wind and solar and you think about your future in the industry, a lot of times I get students ask me, what about wind and solar and how long is oil and gas going to be around? And let's talk about CO2 emissions. And I have all that in here and we can certainly talk about that. But primary energy, the data shows about 82% of primary energy consumption globally is still in natural gas, coal, and oil, okay? Actually, and according to what Chris Wright said at CERAWeek, is that you have to actually, that 8% or whatever that we're seeing for renewables, which is wind and solar and biomass, that you actually have a thermal grade equivalent. So they say it's like 8%, it's probably like 4%. And I would wager that if you didn't shove a bunch of wind and solar into the grid as quickly as we have, you probably wouldn't actually need as much of the coal and the natural gas and oil to backstop it. But really importantly, that's the primary energy consumption of the US on the left and China on the right. The big takeaway is that that green chunk is oil, that red chunk is natural gas. Most developed world countries, including the US, including Europe, still use about 30% primary energy consumption of oil. China is predominantly coal. And more importantly, they have predominantly electricity. So they've invested over time from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Hu Jintao to now, every leader, they've invested heavily in coal-fired power generation. And that is because they build things. They want to manufacture things. And that has to be taken really, really seriously because China has 1/3 of the world's power generation. And so when you think about future war and future conflict and confrontation, we build things. In the military, we have to make things. And in World War II, we had to actually go to our private sector, our Fords and our GMs, and we had to say, help us make planes. You are not going to be able to make a plane or a tank or anything or a battery if you do not have a healthy industrial private sector. And China is doing a damn good job about decimating global auto manufacturing from Europe to the US. So we've had a slug of executive orders as well on energy. I only point this out because they're really serious. And all the executive orders, if you actually read them, there's a thread of national security within them. So from day one, when you had all the executive orders on energy, all those read about geopolitics and national security to a degree. the ones on tariffs on April 2nd, which I have not heard anyone on the stock market actually talk about, those also talked about national security and in terms of actually building up things and making sure we have the capacity to build things in the US. And then these on energy in particular are really serious because those all dropped last week. And this is about just making sure we have lower energy costs. Not necessarily easy to do, but it's something to start putting in place. So it's looking at states and looking how states are unable to, states like Colorado, which are forcing renewables into the grid and decommissioning coal, trying to push back on that to a degree, stop the decommissioning of coal-fired power generation, and just making sure we have affordable and reliable energy. Okay, so big changes that we have seen, I think in the last, if you paid attention to oil and gas and energy in the past 4 years, something you would have really seen is a significant capitulation in industry, right? Fatih Birol, he's the head of the International Energy Agency. He went to CERAWeek, which is the big week we have in Houston in March, and he opened up CERAWeek by saying that we actually need oil and gas investment. Well, this was a big deal within the stock market. This was a big deal within the industry because Fatih Birol has been on the record for years, particularly since 2020, saying that the IEA, that the world needed to actually lead the world in clean energy and that we needed to get rid of oil and gas and we needed to stop investing in oil and gas. That was in 2020. So the IEA, which is a regulatory body designed to actually make sure the world had enough crude oil stockpiles, completely pivoted and said, no, we need to be about green energy during COVID. COVID had nothing to do with energy, but the IEA took that moment to make it political. And this is where we started losing our way a little bit in terms of good analysis and what was actually happening. So I say this because at CERAWeek, there were a lot of industry leaders. This has been lost a little bit because we've had slightly lower oil prices. Now we're at $62 a barrel. But at CERAWeek, we had a lot of industry leaders saying that we were at peak oil. Now, you're not hearing this peak oil as much right now because they're complaining about lower oil prices. But they were talking about peak oil, the fact that the U.S. shale might have peaked in production. And you heard this from industry leaders a lot. And I say this is important to remember to be humble, because if you actually look at all the forecasts from the EIA, the IEA, and OPEC over the course of time, and I just pick, say, like 1998 for the East Asian financial crisis, 2002 when you have the East Asian financial crisis, and then you're heading into the dot-com bubble, particularly if you 2008, you name it, 2020. So when you look at this, what happens is when we're in a crisis, we take the moment we have and we extrapolate it forward. And so if you think we're at peak shale, we're peak oil right now in production, I'm going to say we're not. I can guarantee you we're not, because the industry usually can get more out of the rock, and we will. May not be the exact same we're doing it today, but we will. But the point I'm making here is that the EIA, their high oil price case to 2020 was under $40 a barrel in 2002, okay? In that scenario, they also believed that we were going to have demand to 2020 at 120 million barrels a day of global oil demand. We're about 103 million barrels a day demand now. So they undershot oil prices, they overshot demand. They had OPEC producing about 60 million barrels per day. OPEC does not even produce 30 million barrels a day now. And they sure as hell did not have the US producing 13.5 million barrels a day. So you will get forecasts wrong, and we now have to remember to be humble. So everybody getting really comfortable with we're maxing out production, I don't buy it. And the EIA, in fact, actually has undershot production the last 2 years, and they're the ones that have the data, so they should actually know better. So my point on if tariffs are not about China, they should be. We have this is those de minimis shipments you can just see on that chart on the left here, those shipments that are coming into the US. You can see the massive uptick that we've had. Even Europe is looking at their de minimis rule, which is $150 per person per day, which it was significantly lower than ours. And they're lowering that price because they're getting a lot of stuff dumped in from China. And something the rest of the world is now scared about is the fact if we are not trading with China, China is just going to take all that overcapacity that they have and dump it into the rest of the world. And this is not, it's partly desperation and partly genius, right? China's economy is not doing well. Their consumer economy is declining, the property sector is declining, but their industrial sector is rising. And so the way you sort of survive through this is you continue to keep dumping. But when you continue to keep dumping, you also decimate all this competition. And so Europe and the developing world, they could be in a major pain point if the US is not taking these cheap goods. So all the shipments and the footprint of China into Mexico that is quadrupled since Trump put in tariffs in 2018. We are seeing massive investment and also products coming out of Vietnam as well, as I mentioned. Now that Chinese economy, this is literally just saying what I just showed, this is showing what I just said, which is that consumer economy, that real estate investment way down, the industrial sector and manufacturer way up. So you guys probably remember in January where we had this DeepSeek moment. DeepSeek actually came out. This is a Chinese AI chatbot that was #1 downloaded the moment it dropped. Nobody had heard of this company until 2 weeks prior. People who were following this did, and then it drops. Well, interestingly enough, China says we did this with $6 million or something like that, and we did it within 2 months, which is ludicrous. They also say that they have a former hedge fund manager, tech IPO entrepreneur. He's 29 years old. There's one picture of this guy, literally one. He probably doesn't exist. It's definitely a government company. It certainly wasn't done with $6 million. Everything in the kitchen sink was thrown at it. But the point is that that's how China competes, right? They throw everything at it. And they definitely had the effect that they wanted to, right? They rattled the US stock market. NVIDIA lost more price in a day than any value in history in the stock market performance. So that was huge. And it rattled the entire market, and it got people thinking differently about the future of AI and building all these data centers on spec. So this is the Chinese economy. That purple line is their GDP. So right now, they just came out and said they have 5.4% GDP growth for the first quarter. That's ludicrous. There's no way it's actually 5.4%. But on paper, they say it's like 5%. The point is that's that purple line. The green line up is oil consumption, right? So there's no way you can really have an economy that's declining and oil demand just rising. You can have it to a degree, but you wouldn't have that like uptick, particularly during COVID when China had 0 COVID lockdowns and they shut Shanghai, a massive city, for 2 months, complete shutdown where no one's driving or doing anything. You wouldn't have rising oil demand. So the data doesn't match up. And the point is that they are stockpiling and that there's a lot going on within China right now. Also really important to point out, again, part of the terrorist, part of the competition, why I'm drilling this home like crazy. China is an industrial and manufacturing country that is built on coal. When we look at Chinese versus US industrial electricity consumption, that red line, exponential growth, that is China. That blue line, declining and flat, is the US, okay? We have got to compete better on the industrial side simply because we have to manufacture some of the stuff. Everybody talks about this being about jobs. Yeah, to a degree, it's about jobs. It is also just being able to make sure you can make it here because you cannot be reliant on a foreign adversary for it. That is the Chinese primary energy consumption historically. Real big takeaway. Everybody thinks that China is massively exposed to oil. They're not as exposed to oil as we think. Primary energy consumption is predominantly coal. China is consuming more coal than any country in the entire world. They're about half of global coal consumption. And right now, despite all that you hear about wind and solar and primary energy consumption and everything and this energy transition, which isn't happening, we're consuming more coal today than any point in world history. So we're at record highs. This is global power generation by fuel. This is about 30,000 terawatt hours. That black chunk is coal, the red chunk is natural gas. This is China and the US. So quick takeaways, 9,500 terawatt hours. China has 1/3 of the world's power generation. 5,700 terawatt hours come from coal. We do not even have 1,000 terawatt hours of coal in our entire grid. So when we are going like crazy, decommissioning our coal-fired power generation, putting people out of jobs, taking away electricity, reliability for the consumer and for businesses, China's just building it over there. So you're literally just moving CO2 emissions around the globe and more importantly, giving jobs and dominance to your foreign adversary. So that's that 4,500, and we've risen a little bit, but the point is we have not grown that grid, and we have half the power generation that China does. So that's world coal production and consumption. That's China. They're more than half, as I said. That is global oil and gas consumption. That's oil on the left. That's gas on the right. So gas consumption is 400 billion cubic feet per day globally, and basically one trajectory up. Same for oil consumption. It's not the 120 million barrels a day that the EIA had said in 2002, but it's still basically one trajectory, and that's up, slow and steady. Chinese versus US CO2 emissions, in case you do care about this, is important. China's about 13,000 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, and they're rising. The US is about 5,000 and declining dramatically. That is largely on the back of natural gas power generation pushing out coal, and that's largely market driven. It is important that we basically have a de facto moratorium for mining a coal mine in the US. That did change last week with executive orders under Trump that he's trying to make it to where you can actually mine for coal and actually produce steel. So that's really important. Russia, Australia, Taiwan, China's sort of in everything. That first chart is basically the trade balance between Russia and China. It's 1 for 1. So they trade a lot. It's increased massively since the war in Ukraine. China's continuing to push the envelope and push around the boundaries of Taiwan. They're doing this continually. Most recently, they've been doing a bunch of military exercises around Australia, just doing live fire drills for kicks and giggles. The only reason you do that is a show of force and the fact that you can do that. The war in Ukraine. We're 3+ years into this war in Ukraine. Lots of volatility, as you know, in the past few months, where that map shows you what it looked like the day it happened on February 24, 2022. The far right map is what it looks like right now. So right now we are kind of in a wait and see mode. Zelensky seems to be willing to make a deal. Putin does not seem to be willing to make a deal, or he's willing to make a deal, but it's not the deal that anybody wants because he's not really giving anything. And the war is continuing. So we have not seen an end to this war. We really haven't seen any kind of ceasefire. So that's still ongoing. The exposure that Europe had to Russia was massive. So this is their exposure. That's their gas production on top. That's their consumption on the bottom for Europe. They had about an 18 billion cubic feet per day exposure to Russia. So all these countries that said they were leading the energy transition, they really weren't. They were just taking this natural gas from Russia and consuming it, and then they didn't have it. So they've dropped their consumption, but the U.S. has helped fill that gap with a lot of LNG exports. To drill this home a little bit more, Ukrainian power generation. I'm only showing this to say that power is everything, right? So Russia has really attacked a lot of power generation infrastructure within Ukraine. That's a great way to demoralize a country, right? This is the first case of lessons of war, is that if you take out somebody's power, they can't turn the lights on. So that means they can't make things. They can't make drones. They can't make anti-missile stuff, and they can't protect themselves. But it also means that people just can't turn the lights on and they can't use a refrigerator. So Ukraine's power generation and their economy were not great to begin with, but then it's been just further decimated by this war. I mentioned the attacks in the Red Sea. We're continuing to push back on that. This hard line in Iran is a big deal. It's partly why you're seeing oil prices up a little bit today, is that we are looking to sanction about 2 million barrels a day, or all of Iran's exports. All of those go to China. 2 million barrels a day. In the previous administration, if you were $75, $80 oil, you're looking between $3 billion and $4 billion a month that's going directly from China to Iran, paying for oil. That's enough to fund Hamas, Houthis, Hezbollah, and all these fun little groups that are doing lots of damage in the Middle East. Not fun. The sanctions, we had sanctions from the previous administration placed on Russia. They were not enforced in January. That's why we saw $80 a barrel. They were going to hit ships about 1.6 million barrels a day. That didn't happen, but we've seen so much volatility in oil because of that. We had Iran racing to sell barrels that they had stockpiled in China. So that's just a nod. I mean, clearly there's a lot going between China and Iran. They were trying to sell barrels. And now we have these sanctions on Iran, and we have sanctions on Venezuela. Iran is about 2 million barrels a day that we're looking to sanction. Venezuela produces 800,000 barrels a day. The administration has tied tariffs and sanctions together. So as if tariffs weren't enough, if you are going to buy Venezuelan barrels, you will get an additional 25% tariff. That's China. So just lots and lots of tariffs and sanctions. I think it's smart to couple those together. The Saudis earlier, this is like March, and they said they were going to bring these barrels back. So we had a number of countries saying they're bringing these barrels back. This is kind of a nod to Trump saying that we are going to bring these barrels back so you can sanction these other countries. Now, the timing of this is a little tricky because this was brought up on literally on tariff day on April 2nd, or last week. And so last week, the prices sold off and the timing wasn't super great. Really, I don't think it's that much of a big deal. If you look at the numbers, it was about 400,000 barrels per day. This has not yet hit the market. That's why I say oil prices are pretty oversold. If you look at Saudi and Russian production, that's U.S. production in black, and Saudi and Russian production's in red, Saudi production's in purple. The real takeaway here is that they kind of move together, right? And they don't move crazily. So yes, Saudi's producing 9 million barrels a day. They can produce a lot more than that. They can probably easily produce 10, 11, 12 million barrels per day. If you talk to industry leaders, they often say, could they really produce 12 million barrels a day? The answer is yes, they absolutely can. The break even to produce oil in Saudi Arabia is $6 a barrel. Their fiscal break even that you often hear about is $100 a barrel. But to produce it, it's very, very, very cheap. They do not have to frack it and do the stuff that we do. We love a 700 barrel a day well, and in Saudi, they will plug a 700 barrel a day well. So it is a world of difference. But the point is we are producing way more than they are right now, and we've taken a lot of market share. So we do have a lot of dominance in terms of the energy sphere. And I know I'm running up on time, so if you guys have hands up, get them up. Okay, that's OPEC production. This is our exports. That's just in purple. That's our exports that we're exporting to the world, including crude and product, and that's Saudi and Russia. So I'm trying to emphasize this point. We're the largest exporter of crude and product in the entire world by a wide margin, by a couple of million barrels per day. That's our product exports, our total exports. We're exporting nearly over 11 million barrels per day of crude, of product, and natural gas liquids. That doesn't even include our LNG exports, which we're also the largest exporter in the world of liquefied natural gas, which is about 14 BCF a day. Total global LNG export volumes are roughly 53 BCF a day. So of that 400 billion cubic feet per day global market, LNG or liquefied natural gas is only about 53 BCF a day. That's really important because it means that we have to be actually exporting, we have to be permitting, we have to be building this infrastructure to put this stuff on the market because it's a pretty new and nascent market. And so when you do something like the Biden administration did in January of 2024, and they put a pause on those permits, yeah, they say, oh, it doesn't really do anything. But it actually does a lot because it tells everybody in the world that the U.S. is not open for business. And in the future, you're not going to be able to get this. This is really, really huge because if we started tying LNG exports, if we said, okay, all you countries, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, all you countries that do business with China, we have a deal for you. If you pull away from China a little bit, we will make sure you have LNG. And in fact, when LNG prices, if they spike or something like that, because we have so much natural gas in the US, we'll backstop that with coal. So you have that too. We could do that as the US, and we haven't done it. And that type of stuff, that's what we're talking about with energy dominance. We also have a floor or a put on oil prices. This is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and oil prices. You can see that we sold off crude oil like massive during the Biden administration. This was not because the world was running out of oil. This was because we had high prices for oil, and the Biden administration did not like that. It made them uncomfortable. This is the first time in history, well, not the first time, but massively like that, where an administration actually used the SPR to lower prices, not because it was for security, but because they just didn't like the high prices. So the point is that the Trump administration and the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, will probably be looking to fill those every time prices dip a little bit. So that does put a floor on prices. The health of the economy, and I'm gonna have to go through this fast and click to US shale. The US economy was not looking great in January. It wasn't looking great at the end of last year. The prices at $69 a barrel in December were actually telling you that, right? They were actually telling you that the health of the global economy was not great at $69 a barrel. And that included a lot of geopolitical risk. Now we have something happening where when you look at, say, Kohl's, the predominant shopper at Kohl's makes $50,000 or less or $100,000 or less. They're slowing their spending massively and they're not buying nearly as much stuff. That's your discretionary stuff, like your sweatshirts and your Barbie stuff and your Harry Potter stuff and whatever you're buying at Kohl's. Your higher income consumer, your grocery side, is also feeling it. So if you look at Costco, people who make $100,000, $200,000 a year who are buying groceries, they have also slowed their spending. In fact, they're actually trading down from products like steaks to ground beef. So we're seeing this happen in the data. We're seeing the slowdown. The average hourly work week has really declined. That means that people are working really hard to get to 40 hours a week, right? They're working multiple jobs. So a couple of years ago, you probably heard about quiet quitting, where people were quitting a lot. We have quiet firing now too, where people just put you in a bad position or they don't give you enough hours. And that's what's happening is people aren't making the money. Now, where you add this on to this where we still have inflation, we had a tick down in inflation this past month, but shelter costs, housing costs are still up 4%. Food costs have actually increased. So your grocery prices are still 3% right now. So on top of the 10% or 25% or 30% in many cases that you had of inflation, now you have the deflation on top of inflation. And this is what is really killing the consumer, is that especially food, especially shelter. What happens, this is your big money chart takeaway slide. So if you're falling asleep, this is the time to wake up. Here is oil prices in green. You have inflation in orange. You have your federal funds, your interest rate in black, and you have unemployment in purple. Now, if I was to stretch this all the way back to the 70s, what you would see is that every time you had a spike in inflation, then you had a spike in interest rates, and then about 2 years later, you had a massive spike in unemployment. Now, the Fed is hoping that we won't have that spike in unemployment. We're probably going to get anyway, but the reality is that what's happened is that two big takeaways. We have had previous bouts of high oil prices without inflation. You do not necessarily have inflation with high oil prices. This one, we now have this higher oil prices and inflation. What's happened recently is the Fed dramatically lowered rates in September. They did it too quickly. It shouldn't have been done that quickly. And then you had inflation actually tick back up. And now we're kind of in a holding pattern because of tariffs and this uncertainty within the economy. We have a lot of debt. We have a lot of household debt. So the U.S. is holding a lot of mortgage debt, and they're also having a lot of student loans, as you probably know, credit card debt. All this is, it's not the same as it was in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. It's a lot more. A lot of these mortgages are relatively secure, but I would argue that the recent mortgages in the past several years, a lot of those are at 7% mortgages, and those are a little more risky. So a lot of debt. If we look at vehicle miles traveled and gasoline demand, you can see that vehicle miles traveled it's come back since COVID, but gasoline demand has come down a little bit. So this does tell you about how the consumer has changed their behavior, right? A lot of work from home, changing commuting. People always say, oh, that's EVs. It's not really EVs because you can't really sell an EV unless you get a Cybertruck, and those are kind of all over the place now and they're getting recalled. But it's really more about, we had this spike in oil prices after COVID, and then people changed their consumption behaviors. And so maybe a tiny bit is EVs, but really it's changes in behavior. And we are seeing real concerns within the economy. When we look at airlines, big things happening with airlines on consumer sentiment. United came out today and they basically had two forecasts. They said, here's our recession forecast, and here's our not recession forecast. That's literally what they did as a publicly traded company. The recession forecast was not great. It was basically, we're cutting a bunch of stuff. So all of these airlines, Delta, Southwest, and United, all said there was something happening within consumer sentiment, within the economy in March. So they were starting to see that in February, where people were just changing they thought it was weather, they thought it was the accidents. Then they realized there was something going on with consumer sentiment, and they're seeing this consumer pull back. Jet fuel demand correlates pretty well with oil prices. If your economy is doing okay, jet fuel demand will hang in there, but we're looking now where those are probably going to tick down a little bit. The consumer is tapped out, and if we go into full-on recession, we're just not going to see everybody flying like crazy or buying Louis Vuitton handbags. Those are your air passenger miles. We're starting to see that as well, where that data rolls over. Diesel demand is actually a bit concerning, right? That's diesel demand and oil prices. Obviously, it's a response, one, to that spike in oil prices, but it's a little soft, and we've been soft for the past couple of years. And that really tells you about, that's your Amazon packages, that's your UPS packages, that's the stuff you're buying and sending to your house. We're just not buying as much stuff. That's rail traffic, that's everything. And so it tells you about the health of the economy. That's housing starts and WTI oil prices. So total, that's your single family starts in yellow, tied with oil prices, and that's apartments. What your big takeaway here is that in 2008, we stopped building houses and had that decline 2 years in 2006 before 2008. So that was already coming. Right now, we're kind of tracking in line, but if we start losing jobs, this is when people start selling their homes. In my neighborhood in Denver, I'm seeing a lot of homes up for sale. And so the question is that because people just want to get out? Are they feeling uncertain? Do they need to get out? Do they think they're not going to have a job? There are a lot of question marks right now. We have a lot of debt. And so interest rates, when we're looking at our 10-year yield at above 4%, right now we are seeing military expenditures are over $1 trillion. Our debt is over $1 trillion as well. So our debt is actually more than our military expenditures right now. That's not good. This is German, that's the German grid, right? So German power generation, you can see that it's declined. I put this out here because they led kind of the world in energy transition talk. If you're going to actually energy transition in theory, you would have to build out a lot of power generation. They pay about 30 cents a kilowatt hour. We pay about 18 cents, and they're declining. They've added a bunch of wind and solar into their grid. They've declined their coal, and the result has been that they can't actually produce things because it's really expensive. They've also had a lot of exposure to China, which has been extremely painful, where they export autos and they actually get a lot of autos dumped from China. Our power generation, not great either. We've actually increased prices from 13 cents a kilowatt hour to 18 cents a kilowatt hour in 4 years. That's in red. You'll notice that electricity prices were flat for a decade. And then we all of a sudden have this massive increase in electricity prices, which continue to rise. You may ask why that is. Well, that's your grid. That big chunk is yellow. The black is coal. You got nuclear. And then you've got wind and solar that I put in green. And if you break that out, what you see is that when you decommission coal, really important to this put in here. When we decommission coal, it's our reliable, cheap baseload power. And then we add wind and solar, which is expensive and it's intermittent. That's how you get a recipe for increased electricity prices. Really, really important is that natural gas prices. So the industry that many of you will likely work in or are working in is that Henry Hub prices is what people get paid. They don't actually get paid that. In Colorado, you probably saw 30 cents an MCF last year. In the Permian Basin, people were seeing negative prices. Last year, Henry Hub prices for natural gas were $2 an MCF, 1,000 cubic feet. The residential consumer, what you all paid and what your parents and family paid, was $18 an MCF. That's a massive gap. That's highway robbery. And that is how a lot of utilities companies are making a lot of money. Unlike oil prices, where you see a rising price at the pump and a declining price at the pump, you do not see that for natural gas. And that is wrong and could be corrected. And I think I have just a few minutes. I'm going to close on U.S. shale. We are the largest oil and gas producer in the world. That's natural gas production, about 126 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. As I told you, we have a 400 billion cubic feet per day market. That's oil production, about 13.5 million barrels per day. I say we're resilient sort of regardless of price. We obviously won't be growing if we go down to $50 oil, but we're probably not going to massively drop production. The only way we shut in wells is if we go into the 40s. We aren't going to go into the 40s. We do have a floor because we have that SPR put. And I think you're incrementally going to grow. So industry leaders that are telling you they're not happy with oil prices, they're still drilling, completing wells at $62 a barrel, and I would argue that we are going to continue to do that. I also think the secondary recoveries and the refracking and just going after production, like if you are concerned right now, you should be really going after free production that you're not drilling, completing, just production you have online, putting a pumper on it and maximizing the output, and that helps you maintain production and maintain revenues as well. This is natural gas production in purple. It's basically one direction. We have so much natural gas in the U.S. We have more than we need right now, and that we need to be exporting more. We could basically solve the world's energy problems. But every molecule and every MCF that we put on the water, we are basically helping global energy security, and we are effectively lowering the global spot price for natural gas prices. So natural gas prices that we spike, we need healthier prices. If we had something like $4 an MCF, I think we would stabilize a lot of production in the U.S. and make it work. But we need to get more into the grid and we have to export more. You can see, I only put this here because this is what we say right now that people think about peak shale. Well, that's adorable because I bet you in 2004, when Alan Greenspan got up and told everybody that we need to be importing LNG because we didn't have enough natural gas, he thought we were at peak production as well. And in the 1970s and all this time where we were declining output, in 2008, we were producing 4.8 million barrels a day of crude oil. Fast forward to today, we're producing 13.5 million barrels per day. So you don't know what you don't know, and we do know that we're getting less than 10% of the actual oil out of the rock. So we have a massive shift. Obviously, a lot of that is driven by states like Texas and New Mexico, where we have some of the best rock in the entire world, but also incrementally these other states. We're going to see a big shift, and when you say, what does drill baby drill mean, and what does this administration mean? Well, those are the permits you had under the Trump administration in red. Permits under Biden, so you did have less federal permitting, and then now Trump. We are going to be permitting on federal land, which just gives operators a little more flexibility. If a permit expires, they're going to be able to re-up that permit. That did not happen under the Biden administration. And then really, if you get a permit or you enter into a lease sale, we only had one federal lease sale during Biden, and that was one federal Gulf of Mexico, now Gulf of America lease sale. We're going to be having more of those. That's really good thinking about long-term health of the production and resiliency. I care a lot about resiliency of output and maintaining the output and actually having national energy policies on that for security reasons and otherwise. Also, the drill baby drill and frack, what does that mean? Well, look, NGL prices or natural gas liquids prices are tied to crude oil prices. So if we have $62 a barrel, we're going to have pretty decent natural gas prices. And if we have close to $4 an MCF natural gas prices, that means that all of that's going to work actually pretty well. And so operators are going to be looking at natural gas, whether it's the liquids rich or it's condensate or it's dry gas, they're going to be looking toward that. And I actually think activity, as of right now, it's pretty healthy, and it might be more healthy than people think. That's Texas and New Mexico production. It's a cool chart. That's almost as much as Saudi Arabia is producing, just those two states alone. That is 2 counties in New Mexico, Lee and Eddy County, are producing 2 million barrels per day. That's just incredible. I mean, that means that you have some of the best rock in the entire world, but just something we have to appreciate that you just don't have in the rest of the world is this type of rock and this type of ingenuity. Quiet growth, really important to point out, 600,000 barrels per day between Wyoming, Utah, and Ohio. States that nobody's paying attention to because they're just incrementally crushing it. Utah, you're really seeing that ratchet up. Definitely Ohio and Wyoming just incrementally adding production. These are states where you're seeing a lot of private activity. And so that private activity is really important to think about in terms of public and private operators. Publics may not like this oil price. Privates are probably okay. And they are putting the drill bit back in the ground. So, and they care a lot about the regulatory environment. This is the rig count and lateral length. big reason why we are continuing to say we have far less rigs running and we have far less wells being brought onto production, and yet we are producing more oil. So simple but nerdy takeaway slide. This is your rig count in black. So you dropped from COVID, you dropped massively. We came back. We didn't add as many rigs as we had pre-COVID. We topped out at 784 rigs. And then we've since dropped and we've hung out under 600 rigs. And now but we have an average lateral length that's incrementally risen. I'm going to go through this really quickly. That's your public-private rig count. You can see that split. Those are publics in orange. Those are privates in purple. Really, really importantly, this is your horizontal completions, and I'm going to close with this. So stacked on top of each other, those are the wells that you bring online and into production. That's orange, that's public. That's purple, that's private. Those are oil prices, and there's a direct correlation with those private companies and oil prices. So when oil prices go up, the public companies went to the public companies held back out of COVID, and the private companies went to the races. What you're seeing now is that the private companies are actually responding to the regulatory environment. And with that, I'm going to close. Thank you.
Take out a piece of paper and let's have a quick pop quiz, okay? Hey, thanks for being here. You people on Zoom, stick around for the QR code. My students, if you didn't sign in on the attendance sheet, be sure and come down front and do that. Thanks for being with us this semester, and we look forward to seeing you guys this fall if you're coming back to the law school. Thank you.